religious, ideological overview of the contours and primary commitments of an approach to politics that had sort of been summarized under the label of Muslim democracy. Now, the book is somewhat unique. So it consists, first of all, in 10 very important essays by Sheikh Raşid. And these were selected by him and myself as some of the most important essays that elaborate on a mode of thinking about politics, democracy, freedom, sovereignty, and religion that were sort of reflective of a particular turn towards a different way of thinking from the history of much 20th century Islamic and Islamist political thought. So the core of the book are these 10 essays. I also have an introduction in which I try to give my interpretation of this turn from what I call Islamic democracy to Muslim democracy. And then after these 10 essays, Sheikh Raşid and I had a week or more of dialogues in his home in which we discussed all kinds of things, from his biography and formation, the contours, the meaning of democracy, sovereignty, morality, the meaning of the Sharia, the understanding of the traditional idea of humanity as God's caliph, and then the scope of freedom, pluralism, toleration. So a large chunk of the book are these dialogues between him and myself going back and forth. I also want to point out that I recently published an article in the journal Political Theory in which I try to elaborate some of these ideas. Now, one of the goals for the talk today, and what I also hope is part of the conversation between you and me, is how to understand this turn towards an understanding of politics that we can call Muslim democracy. And I just want to anticipate, before my conclusion, that I want to emphasize a few concepts. First, it is a turn beyond the concept of sovereignty as the central organizing pillar of Islamic thought. And I'll explain what I mean by that. And second, that it is not just a matter of what we sometimes call in the West moderation or embracing democracy, but I think reflects a particular approach to politics and the political that in political theory we sometimes call agonism. So just briefly, do you study political theory? Are you guys in political science? Both? Yes. Have you encountered the concept of agonism or agonistic political theory? Okay, I'll try to say something about that. But I have sort of my own argument about what Muslim democracy represents or amounts to historically in the trajectory of Islamic political thought. But there's other ways that we can look at it, and that's part of the discussion that I want to have. This is him and myself. You can guess by the change in the hair color how many years ago this was. You can keep that to yourselves. All right. So the first thing that I want to say is, as I mentioned, I think the place to begin is here. From Islamic democracy to Muslim democracy. So the embracing of the term Muslim democracy represents a certain sort of transformation, or at least a decision to emphasize certain sorts of concepts rather than others. So I want to begin, and again, I mentioned that for me, the term beyond the centrality of the concept of sovereignty, hakimiyet or siyaset, hakimiyya or siyada, I think is central to understanding this. So, hoş geldiniz. So the first thing I want to begin with is the traditional approach to politics that we see in what I refer to as high utopian Islamism, in thinkers like Sayyid Abu al-Maududi or Sayyid Qutb, who sort of created modern Islamist ideology made central the emphasis on hakimiyatullah, or divine sovereignty. So I want to emphasize two things right here. The background to this transformation is a primary emphasis on a number of concepts. Central amongst them are this idea of divine sovereignty and the idea of the universal caliphate. So, in writings of figures like Maududi, Qutb, and even some of Sheikh Rashid's writings, you find a strong emphasis on the importance of divine sovereignty, which is defined as the supremacy and sufficiency of the Islamic Sharia. So you read a lot of these figures, and all of politics can be explained by the idea of divine sovereignty, and sort of the idea that almost all politics is law. God has an answer for everything, the law has an answer for everything, and so politics is sort of reduced to an application of the law. This obviously raises a set of questions: how and who? Who determines what the divine law is? How do we know what it is? And how is it enforced? Now, the second most important concept is the theological doctrine of the people as God's caliph. So you see this in many, many thinkers, starting in the early 1920s and 30s, but particularly in Maududi. You see this idea that the central idea of Islamic political thought is that the entire ummah, or people, or millet, is God's Khalifa. So Maududi himself, at one point, even says that the ideal Islamic state is not a theocracy ruled by priests, but a kind of theodemocracy. So the idea of what I call the caliphate of man, or the universal caliphate, is ultimately a pathway to a kind of popular sovereignty. And there's some important features of this. First is the idea that in Islam, there are no divinely appointed agents between God and the people. It's a kind of Protestantism, right? There are no kings, no rulers, not even the scholars stand in a position of authority between God and the entire people. So the people, in the singular, right, the ummah, in a certain sense, becomes sovereign. Now, on my reading, most importantly, in the earlier writings of Sheikh Rashid, you have the development of a full ideal theory of a distinct regime type, which I refer to as Islamic democracy. I don't want to dwell on this too much. So this is a little bit about the concept of sovereignty. If we're going to say there's a theory of the people as sovereign, what has to be the case? What powers or authorities do the people have to have in order to say they're sovereign? And some of the crucial aspects are to what extent does a Muslim people have constituent power? That is, to what extent can the people create new political forms? Oftentimes, in classical Islamic law, in fiqh, it's said that certain offices like the imama or the khalifa are obligatory. You have to appoint a caliph, so the people has some authority in helping to choose this, but does not have authority to say, we want a different style of regime. So one important question would be, to what extent, in a theory of Islamic politics, does the people have the power to create and recreate the sphere and the scope of politics? Second, to what extent does the people have authority over the law? If, as in many Islamic thinkers, God is sovereign and the law is sovereign, and only the ulama, only the scholars can speak in the name of the law, and their understanding has to be obeyed, then we can't really speak of the people as sovereign. And third, how do we imagine the sphere of coercion and violence in political life? And to what extent is that authorized or controlled by the people? All right, now, prior to the writings in this book, Sheikh Rashid published a very, very important book in 1993 called Public Freedoms in the Islamic State, or Al-Hurriyat al-Amma fi al-Dawla al-Islamiyya, which has now been translated into English with Yale University Press. My argument is that in this extremely important book, Sheikh Raşid develops a theory of an Islamic state, of an Islamic public order, of an Islamic constitution that elaborates a theory of democracy, elaborates a theory of public freedoms, but develops a distinct kind of regime type that is not merely a kind of justification for Western parliamentary democracy. So, remember, the theme of the lecture is from Islamic democracy to Muslim democracy. So I want to introduce right now what I regard as 7 important features of a theory of Islamic democracy that I think are going to be different from what's elaborated under the theory of Muslim democracy. And I just want to anticipate. So right now we have these 7 features. In a little bit, when we talk about Muslim democracy, I want to emphasize 6 different features. So when we get here, I want you to try to remember what we talked about here. So the first element is, I'll tell you a story partly about how I got here. One day, about 15 years ago, I picked up Sheikh Raşid's book, Public Freedoms in the Islamic State, and I was interested. I expected to find lots of views about Islamic law, Islamic legal theory, usul al-fiqh, how to derive Islamic law, how to apply Islamic law, and I was very surprised by what I found. And what I found in that book was much more a kind of political, theological meditation on humanity, on the status of humanity vis-a-vis God and vis-a-vis one another, and from there, the development of a theory of politics. So the first element of a theory of Islamic democracy is the absolute centrality and emphasis on this idea of the universal khilafah, or khilafat al-insan, the caliphate of the people. And this means many, many things. So I encourage everybody to explore this idea if you have the time. It's a concept that does a lot of work. First of all, it establishes a certain kind of status for humanity. Humanity inherently has a certain kind of karama, or dignity, but also has a certain kind of political status vis-a-vis the state and vis-a-vis rulers. So the people is God's caliph, which implies a certain kind of political authority. But the theory is also a theory of what we call theological anthropology. It talks about, sort of in Aristotelian fashion, what capacities the human has, what ultimate needs the human has, what sort of possibilities and powers the human has. And it develops a theory of human rights from the implications of humanity as God's caliph. It's also a kind of aspiration. So God's caliph is what humanity is, but it's also something to live up to aspire to attain through various aspects of moral perfection. All right, second, and this is very, very important. This is perhaps the most crucial distinction between a theory of Islamic democracy and Muslim democracy. So in political philosophy, we sometimes refer to theories that are perfectionist versus non-perfectionist. Perfectionist theories say that the purpose of government and the purpose of politics is to realize a certain conception of the good. So you posit that there is a particular way for humans to live their best life. There is a particular kind of flourishing and a particular way in which human lives go better than in other ways. Now, in other theories, certain kinds of liberalism or secularism, the assumption is that people choose their own paths of life, or they choose their own conceptions of the good life, or that the job of the state is only to advance security, stability, justice, but not to encourage people to live a particular way of life. So the first thing to emphasize is that in Public Freedoms in the Islamic State, and in almost all Islamic political thought, politics is seen in perfectionist terms. So Gannuşi writes, this is a direct translation, the purpose of politics is to create the conditions for people to live in innate accord, tawafuk fitri, with the divine law. So that's a very clear encapsulation of the purpose of government, right? Human beings have a fitra, human beings have a purpose. That purpose is sort of matched with the divine law, and the purpose of politics is to create the conditions for us to live that most ideal life. Third, the idea of divine sovereignty does not go away. There still is a strong emphasis on the Sharia and the importance of it being realized in some way. Fourth, there is a strong emphasis on moral unity within society. So, again, in many liberal or secular theories, hoş geldiniz. We often begin by assuming difference. We assume people have different beliefs, people have different goals, people have different interests, and that the purpose of politics is to manage those conflicts and those differences. Now, there are other theories of politics, certain kinds of Republican theories, certain kinds of socialist theories, in which the assumption is that the people, in the singular, can have a kind of moral unity, can be united around a shared purpose, a shared conception of the good, a shared kind of goal. So that's an important distinction between different kinds of political theories. And in Sheikh Rashid's earlier writings, there's a very clear preference for this emphasis on there's toleration, there's pluralism, there's a space for disagreement, but fundamentally, the society has enough unity around Islam that institutions are meant to be integrated in certain kinds of shared purposes. Fifth, the people is the source of all political authorities. Sha'ab masdar as-sulutat. So any political authorities, executive, legislative, even judicial, only derive their authority from the people actually appointing them. So this is where you get a very, very deep commitment to popular sovereignty. Sixth, there is significant constituent power. So the theory does not just say, like some hadith reports, that the people has to appoint a caliph, and so therefore all the people can do is help elect the right person for that job. Rather, the argument is that the kinds of institutions that are created are a matter of public interest or maslaha or maslahat. And so the people collectively has wide authority to decide what kinds of institutions and constitution that it wants. And finally, and here on my view, is where this theory becomes most deeply committed to popular sovereignty. So we mentioned the idea of divine sovereignty and the idea that the Sharia still matters. But what is the Sharia and how is it applied? So in a lot of this book, there are deep explorations of the way in which the Sharia is to a large extent determined by the people. The people engages in ijtihad. The people publicly, through public opinion, through civil society, deliberates on how you have this kind of mixing of divine revelation with consideration of public interest. So, on my view, these are the 7 features that most explain this sort of ideal theory of an Islamic democracy. So it's deeply democratic. So everything depends on the people. But it's a people that is Muslim. Not entirely. There's scope for disagreement and there's scope for toleration and pluralism, but the core of the political community is united around these moral purposes. All right, there's a few quotes that sort of encapsulate this idea of the Khilafat al-Insan or the Caliphate of the entire Ummah, but I'll sort of move on. The argument, then, is that this theory of Islamic democracy is a kind of republic of virtue. That is, it well, let's start a little bit further back. First of all, as I mentioned earlier, it's not a theory of Western parliamentary democracy. In fact, it begins with a very sort of profound and sophisticated critique of Western democracy. That is, many of the institutions and mechanisms are good. Rule of law, independent judiciary, elections, trade unions, these sorts of things. But the argument is that Western democracy has no foundation. It rests on no morality other than whatever the people happens to want. So part of the argument is that if you have these democratic mechanisms, but they rest on a moral foundation of true morality that the people has sort of embraced, then democracy can be protected against itself. Now, one of the core questions of political theory in general is how can a political system protect itself against tyranny? Suppose you set up a democratic system. Suppose you get rid of dictatorship. Suppose you create a new constitution, right? God willing, the Syrians will now have the opportunity to close the prisons, get rid of the Baathists, and create a new, a just constitution. But how will they be able to keep it? How can you guarantee that in 10 years, 15 years, that system will not degrade once again into authoritarianism? So traditionally, there's different answers to that. In Western political theory, Montesquieu, James Madison, who wrote the American Constitution, the answer is institutional design. You create checks and balances. Trump wants to steal the election, but he can't just declare it on his own. It has to go through so many institutions that somebody will stop him, at least last time. Probably not next time. So that's the classical Republican view, that you create rules that prevent the concentration of power. Interestingly, Sheikh Raşid has lots of things to say about that. Many of them positive. Separation of powers is good. Checks and balances are good. But it's not enough. And it's more a theory for the West than it is for Muslims. Muslims have a kind of moral unity that supersedes the idea of division of powers for their own sake. The classical Islamic answer was very different. The classical Islamic answer was you have the law, you have the scholars, but then you hope that the caliph is good. The caliph is kind of the check against corruption and tyranny and conflict within society. So in that context, I think we can appreciate what Sheikh Raşid was trying to do, not in this book, but in Public Freedoms in the Islamic State. That the modern Islamic democratic answer to tyranny, it's a combination of democracy, collective self-rule, moral unity of the people, and the people as virtuous. The people will never allow Islam to be hijacked. The people will never allow a ruler who's under their control to do something tyrannical. All right. Now, that's kind of a background to help you appreciate the significance of some of the moves that we're about to discuss. So, as you all know, revolution in Tunisia 2011, Egypt 2011, the constituent moments, the periods of drafting the constitution went on for 2 years in Egypt, 3 years in Tunisia. During this period, Gannuşi's Ennahda party had a pluralist in the first constituent assembly, about 40% of the representation. As you may remember, much less than in Egypt. So in Egypt during the same period, the combined representation of the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafi parties was closer to 40%. So in Tunisia, you had a much more balanced sort of state of affairs in which no single party, ideology, or orientation was able to dictate a new constitution. So, what did you get in Tunisia? You got a democratically negotiated more or less entirely secular constitution. Now, the democratically negotiated is an important aspect of this, because in many countries, there have been elections. There have been Islamist parties that have participated in politics. There have been Islamist parties that said, we're now Muslim Democrats, or we're not trying to transform the system. But in all of these examples, perhaps Turkey in the early 2000s, Malaysia, Pakistan, Jordan, Morocco, all of these choices took place in, as Karl Marx would say, in circumstances not of their choosing. They were operating under an existing authoritarian regime or under a monarchy that opened up spaces. And various parties, Islamist, secular, leftist, would operate within those. And moderation, if you want to use that term, was kind of a necessary response to the fact that the system was controlled by the existing regime. In Tunisia, even more than in Egypt, where the army always had their gun to the head of the political process, the political process was radically open. It was one of the most democratic constitution-making processes that has ever existed. Traditionally, the military was not as hegemonic, and so you have the significant fact that Gannuşi's party is itself helping to draft a constitution that it is responsible for. Second, the reality of real politics, not sort of an ideal theory, having to form coalitions, the reality of public opinion, actually existing difference. What kinds of political opinions are there actually in society, and not how does classical Islamic jurisprudence imagine it? And third, the reality of governance. So this is a quote from one of Sheikh Rashid's very, very close and long-standing associates, who now, tragically, along with Sheikh Rashid, is also in jail and was recently on hunger strike. Firjani, I don't know if he stopped it. Islamism ended. Think about this expression. Islamism ended once Ennahda entered government and shared responsibility for social and economic provision and became accountable to the electorate and to civil society. Now, whether or not you agree with this, there's a sense that there's a shift. So remember what I said about Islamic democracy. It begins kind of in theology. It begins with this statement about humanity as God's caliph, as what is revelation, what kind of being is the human. This begins with politics, with the facts of politics, not with theology or not with theory. I want to introduce, by contrast, two quotes that are significant for being juxtaposed very closely to one another temporally. So in 2012, Sheikh Rashid republishes a book in which he says the state loses its legitimacy and right to obedience to the extent that it departs from the law, that is the Sharia. This is what discredits every accusation against the Islamic State, that it is an absolutist authoritarian state. So you have this sense that it is still Islamic law that is the check against tyranny, because it is the rule of law, not the rule of people, but that law is the Islamic Sharia. 1 year later, almost at the end of the negotiations over the Constitution, when discussing whether the new Constitution should reference Sharia, Sheikh Rashid writes, in Islam there is no church that can monopolize the interpretation of Islam, but this is left rather to the Ummah and the people through its institutions that translate the meanings of the phrase Arab Islamic identity. So the Constitution declared that the state has an Arab Islamic identity, but it's for the people to decide what that means. It's not decided prior to politics by religion. And so when the question of Sharia was raised, we found it to be a subject of disagreement. But constitutions are not adopted on the basis of what there is disagreement around, but rather what is agreed upon. So you have a strong emphasis on the idea that politics itself, the creation of a political space, is a kind of fragile, tenuous accomplishment that itself is constructed not on the basis of truth, not on the basis of religious truth, but on the basis of contract and agreement. So, I mentioned earlier that there are these 7 features of what I understand to be Islamic democracy. So now, throughout these writings, I kind of picked apart out of all of these things what I sort of thought were the consistent threads. First is the centrality of freedom. So 2 of the most important essays in this book, my favorites by far, are Basic Freedoms in Islam and Freedom First. Now, throughout both of these essays, there are a number of arguments being put forward. First is the argument that in the context of dictatorship and tyranny, whatever your ideological orientation, Islamist, secular, or whatever, freedom from tyranny, from torture, from imprisonment, from dictatorship is the absolute priority. You remove that, and then you can discuss other things. But more importantly, is a very, very sophisticated reflection on various conceptions of freedom. So, I don't know if you guys have studied figures like the English philosopher Isaiah Berlin, who spoke about 2 concepts of liberty, positive liberty and negative liberty. So Islamists like Maududi and Qutb traditionally would advance a kind of positive conception of liberty. Freedom means being a good Muslim. You are free when you do what God says. It's not whatever you want, that's your whim, your hawa, your own will. Freedom is freeing yourself from the desire to do other than what God wants. That conception of freedom does not disappear in these writings, but it's enhanced by an appreciation for other kinds of freedoms. The idea that nothing in Islam has value if it's coerced. The purpose of Islam is not to create hypocrites. Nothing from the shahada to fasting to prayer has value unless it's completely voluntarily undertaken. An exploration of the importance of civil freedoms, political freedoms. So first of all, there's this sense that enjoying a wide range of freedoms that can only be enjoyed in a democracy are central to human flourishing, human well-being, and even to realizing Islamic conceptions of virtue. So that's one very important sort of background intellectual context. The second, remember this discussion of politics as perfectionist. That kind of goes away. Now we see the idea that politics is a contract between specific parties, mostly around worldly goods, security, law, economics, these sorts of things. Third, in place of the emphasis on moral unity, is the idea of the fact of actual pluralism. The existing range of pluralism is a constraint on politics, not the ideal conception of pluralism. So you can read any a work of Islamic law, and you will talk about a kind of pluralism, right? There are Muslims, and then there are good Jews and Christians. And they have religious freedom, and they have rights, and they have protection. And that's how a lot of Islamic writing treats the problem of toleration. Of course, we tolerate other people of the book, other kitabis. That's great, but that's not what the world is like. The world is not just comprised of good Muslims, good Jews, and good Christians. The world is comprised of communists, feminists, radical secularists, members of the old elite, and all of them participate in politics. So there's a strong emphasis that politics is about the people that you actually live with and not some ideal conception of an ummah. 4, agreement and consensus as the first virtue of politics at the constitution-making level. So again, you see this quote, constitutions are adopted on the basis of what is agreed upon, not things that are matters that divide people. Fifth, you have this redescription of the Sharia as anything that limits government. You're going to see a quote in a second to this effect. Now, you might ask yourself, or you might say, I see what's democratic about this, but what's Muslim about this approach to democracy? And the central answer to that, the concept that emerges more than any other, is this emphasis on the Covenant of Medina, the Prophet's wathiqa in Medina, which, according to Gannuşi and many, many others, has the feature of being pluralist. It's not just between Muslims, but also between Jews and other tribes. And it is primarily concerned with worldly matters. Security, defending the city, the diya, or the blood tax. If somebody from this tribe kills somebody from that tribe, who pays the diya? These are the things that you find in the wathiqa. So he actually writes at one point, we Muslims are lucky that our first state was a pluralist state. The sort of implication being, if pluralism was good enough for the Prophet, how could it not be good enough for us? So here you see a number of quotes, again, on this idea about the idea that consensus and agreement is the foundation of politics. You see, there was a number of controversial things in the Constitution. So one of them was the dispute between a parliamentary and a presidential system. So, and Nakhta and others preferred a more pure parliamentary system. Others wanted a presidential system. The final constitution was a kind of mixed system. Another was the language on human rights. So, in addition to having commitments to human rights, there were certain kind of statements that human rights were universal. And so you see similar language that the Constitution must be adopted on the basis of human values because we are a part of this humanity that crystallized and clarified a number of principles, such as the principles of democracy and human rights. Our view is that we Islamists must be happy with the general consensus of humanity, that humans have rights, whatever their gender or religion. And for this reason, we should not object to the idea of the universality of human rights, since this is one of the guarantees of rights and freedoms. So again, there's a lot of emphasis on not a kind of prior metaphysics or truth or interpretation, but on what the political system itself presents to you and how you can make sense of that. Okay, so I want to close then by asking a few questions about this. So, first, to what extent are these comments about the new constitution, about Muslim democracy, to what extent are these sort of enduring, permanent, or long-standing views about politics? And to what extent are they sort of immediate reactions to a constitution? So how seriously should we take some of these ideas? And I sort of see two questions. One, when Sheikh Raşid says something like, the Sharia was only sent down by God to limit government. So if anything limits government, that is good enough for what the Sharia's purpose is. Now, is that idea of Sharia permanently sort of declared to have that orientation? Or is this something that could change if the politics and demographics of a Tunisian society changes? So if in the future you have a larger majority of Tunisians that are religious and that are oriented towards the Sharia, can are you constrained by that prior understanding of the Sharia as limited to constitutional government? And the second, and this is probably the thing that I spent more time talking to him about than anything else, which is what is the scope and depth of pluralism? So it's one thing to accept other political parties as facts of life that have civil rights, that have political rights, rights of participation. It's another thing to accept freedom of conscience or the right of others to pursue their life. But in order to be deeply committed to that, do you have to have some sense that people's beliefs and epistemic orientations and religious beliefs and views about metaphysics that differ from Islam or that differ from any theistic view are themselves reasonable? Or do you just sort of tolerate them as facts of life? So that's sort of another question about how deep your philosophical and metaphysical commitment to pluralism has to go in order to be a Democrat. All right, so I want to end now with some sort of questions about how we should think about this idea or this orientation of Muslim democracy. It's a little out of order, but I want to begin here. One view would be none of this matters. This isn't really political theory. It's not political thought. It's not a contribution to Islam. It's just rhetoric. It's just a party saying, don't worry about us. We're not trying to take over. Don't put us in jail. We're more like Christian Democrats. But it isn't really a deeply thought out conception of politics. So that's sort of my impression of what the AKP was doing in the early 2000s. I know there were intellectuals like Davutoglu and others, but I don't know if the AKP was putting out a kind of elaborate theory of how they understand politics in relation to religion. So one view is that Muslim democracy is just a kind of branding. It's just a way of signaling to other people in your society and perhaps those outside of the country what your intentions are, but we shouldn't take it very seriously as political theory. I don't think that's always wrong, but I think as this book demonstrates, there is a very elaborate attempt to think through some of the core problems that intersect a commitment to Islam as true as a religion and a commitment to politics as a kind of practice. So let me throw out a few other frames or ways of thinking about this. Now, do you guys read John Rawls here at Boğaziçi? No? I'm not getting a lot of feedback on that. Okay. John Rawls was a political theorist in America at Harvard who wrote a book, published a book in 1971 called The Theory of Justice. And then in 1993, published a book called Political Liberalism. And Rawls was sort of concerned with how a society that's characterized by pluralism, religious disagreement, could be stable. How can we disagree on morality and truth, and yet at the same time come to agreement about a shared conception of justice and democracy? So Rawls posited that there were three possibilities. One, he said, is a modus vivendi. You just agree to live together so you're not fighting. And so you don't deeply theorize what you're doing. You just prefer politics to fighting. But you don't have any sort of shared conceptions beyond that. That may be something like what's going to happen in Syria. You may have groups like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and the Kurds and other militant groups that come from very, very radically different backgrounds, but somehow agree that there's been enough fighting so they can form some kind of shared government. A second possibility is that Rawls said parties can have a deeper commitment to democracy, and they can agree on the principles of a constitution, and yet continue to disagree on matters of metaphysics, theology, ethics, morality. And then a third possibility, Rawls talked about something called an overlapping consensus, where people disagree on the meaning of life, but they have a sort of a shared conception of what rights humans have and how you justify political power. So one plausible account, if you're a political theorist, is that Muslim democracy represents a kind of Rawlsian constitutional consensus. So you see Sheikh Raşid giving reasons, giving deep defenses of democracy, giving deep defenses of personal and collective freedoms. So the commitment to democracy and constitutionalism is not tactical. It's not, we couldn't win, so for now we'll do this. There are deep justifications of democracy. But at the same time, you don't give up other sorts of views about metaphysics, theology, religion, the person, that may not be fully worked out with others. Okay, another account, and this is also sort of Rawlsian, which is the difference between Islamic democracy and Muslim democracy is like a difference between ideal theory and non-ideal theory. You might say, in certain ideal conditions, all human beings would accept more or less the veracity of the existence of God and revelation. And in those cases, most people can be moral, they can be virtuous, they're not primarily committed to their private interest. And in those conditions, what would a perfect democracy look like? So that's a kind of ideal theory of how you'd reconcile divine revelation with human agency. But in reality, we live in a non-ideal world. We live in an ideal world, a non-ideal world that has history. History of colonialism, history of dictatorship, history of coercive authoritarianism. So societies are complex. Social trust is very low. People are not sort of tied together by strong bonds of social trust. And so in that non-ideal world, you create a different theory that tries to get as much of what is good as possible. And that good is non-dictatorship, non-civil war, as much democracy as possible, as much civil liberties as possible, and thus also as much religious freedom as possible. And then finally, what I want to suggest, and this is, it doesn't necessarily go against these, but one of the things that you'll note is that while most 20th century Islamist political thought was oriented around the problem of sovereignty, and Gannuşi's earlier work is a great example of this. So, الحرية العامة في الدولة الإسلامية, public freedoms in the Islamic State, is in the English translation, it's 500 pages. In Arabic, it's around 300. Meditation on sovereignty, on divine sovereignty, and on popular sovereignty. But sovereignty is a particular sort of concept. The concept of sovereignty suggests a kind of unity, a voice that speaks in a single way or a single voice, finality, right? You can speak about sovereignty because some sovereign agent, God, a king, or the people, has spoken in a definitive final way that you can interpret and that can serve as a source of legitimacy. One of the things that you notice about this book is that the whole problem of sovereignty drops away. You don't have the same, there's no discussion at all of when is the people sovereign? What does the people have to do or be in order to be sovereign? It's just assumed that in a democracy, whatever people there is writes its own constitution, chooses its leaders, and then significant disagreement and bargaining continues beyond that. So, second, you have this concept of agonism. Agonism is a theory of politics that stresses the ongoing fact of disagreement and conflict in society. There's never a kind of permanent unity around what the people wants, what the people believes. There's always different interests. There's always different struggles. And so politics, by definition, is this struggle between views and struggle between a desire for hegemony, but that occurs within democracy. So in Gannuşi's views, you see a very, very strong sense that that whether you are a friend or an enemy is not about whether you're Muslim or not Muslim. It's about whether you are committed to democracy or not. So you could be a Muslim, but you could desire to destroy democracy. And in that sense, you could be sort of a hostile entity. You could be a secularist, but as long as you remain committed to democracy, not excluding anyone else, not destroying your enemies, not putting them in jail, you can be a certain kind of respected rival. So what I discern in a lot of these writings is that politics is very fragile, but the social sphere is one of radical disagreement. And so the primary purpose of political action and leadership is to create a system in which democracy can exist and in which struggles can be contained within democracy without devolving to war or a renewed dictatorship, but that within that space, parties still struggle for their vision of what they want. So this might not apply here, but in the West, people are obsessed with the idea of moderate Islam or moderate Muslims. And they kind of have this sense that if you're really going to be moderate, you have to be moderate about everything. So they're always obsessed with, have you shown some commitment? That means that you probably don't need all these other moderate things. So, for example, when the late president, Beşir Essebsi, tried to change the family law code to create equality in inheritance between men and women, and Nahda, or large parts of it, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, opposed this because the former family law preserved some elements of Islamic law. Earlier in the process, there was a proposal to ban certain kinds of speech hostile to muqaddasat, right? Religious sacred symbols. Now, somebody could say, see, these guys are not moderate. They still want to, have gender inequality, or they want to limit freedom of speech. But on my theory, this is not a mystery, and this is not a contradiction. Because politics by nature is a struggle for the things that you want. but it takes place within a commitment to doing so without destroying or vanquishing or killing or expelling your rivals. So that's what I mean by a kind of post-sovereigntist, agonistic political Islam. It doesn't begin by saying sovereignty explains everything. It begins with the fact of politics. What is politics actually like? And what are the ways in which politics can be created and sustained by responsible actors while people still struggle for their preferred vision of a social good? All right, I'm going to pause there, see if there's any questions or discussion, and see what else we want to come back to. Yes.
How was Sheikh Gannuşi, in which level he was successful in succeeding his ideal system in Tunisia?
His ideal system? Or
nation.
Muslim democracy?
Yes.
So I want to give an answer to that question with a kind of an anecdote. So remember back here, what's the check against tyranny? How do you prevent a system from devolving into tyranny or dictatorship or corruption? And in his original theory, there was lots about institutions, parliaments, judiciary, courts, presidency. So institutions were very important. But ultimately, the thing that he kept on stressing was the role of the people. Public opinion, the people's commitment to its own freedom, so on and so forth. Now, the last conversation that I ever had with him in person was December 2021 or January 2022. The coup had already been on for 6 months, so he had a lot of time. He wasn't in Parliament all the time anymore. He was at home, and there were lots of demonstrations against the coup. And there was a sense that maybe democracy can be restored. This might not be over, okay? So I asked him, based on your now 10 years of being in politics, what lesson have you drawn about what makes democracy successful? When does democracy succeed? And when does democracy fail? And without thinking, he immediately said, اتفاق النخب, the agreement of the elites. And so the lesson that he had drawn was democracy is sustained when the various representatives of various forces are responsible and are morally committed to sustaining democracy. Now, you can see why he would think this. So democracy in Tunisia almost failed many times before the 2021 coup. There was the crisis year of 2013 and 14. You had the coup in Egypt. You had a number of assassinations in Tunisia at that time. You had constant meddling from international media, the Emirates, Abu Dhabi, old regime media. Many people that didn't want either democracy to succeed or could not accept that Islamists would be in power or Islamists would even be part of the system. And you guys probably don't remember this, but some of you look old enough to remember this. Turkey used to be this way, right? And before the 2000s, you know, most adherents of Kemalism could not imagine that a religious movement should have any place in public life. They could not accept it on grounds of principle. So many Tunisians have that same view because of the style of laiklik that they also have there. Now, what happened? First of all, for 3 years, there was an agreement between Gannouchi's party and some center-left parties. Then there was another election, and those center-left parties didn't do very well. And so there was a kind of an agreement, I think it took place in Paris, between Gannouchi and the man that became president, Beji Qaida, who, this is a figure, imagine that like Mustafa Kemal's Minister of Sports was still alive today and became president. It's like that. Like somebody that was first of all, old enough to be like that, but also really was part of the old secular elite. And there was an agreement between them to maintain the process, share power. There was many sacrifices. And Nahda pulled out of government. During this long period, they didn't demand the most powerful ministries, but there was a kind of sharing of power. And so you could see why he would get this sense that we almost drove off the cliff in 2013 and 14. But even these old secularists said, let's keep Ennahda in the political system. And so what saved it was not masses of people rushing out to save democracy, but responsible elites making a decision to govern together. Now, many people criticize that move. Many people who were, let's say, more pro-revolutionary thought that was a mistake. They thought that was like selling out the revolution. But it was a decision that kept the Constitution and the political system going for another 7 years. So how successful was he? First of all, he's not the only one responsible for this political system. And given that it could have collapsed earlier, the enormous efforts to maintain a kind of consensus-based government succeeded for a considerable amount of time. Third, the coup of 2021 was not inevitable. It was a kooky old man with very, very weird psychology and delusions of all kinds of things and a lot of stubbornness that decided that the answer to a political crisis was dissolving democracy. That happens a lot, but it was not inevitable. And so, with a different president, with a different decision, we still might be talking about democracy in Tunisia today. So, right now, it doesn't look successful. Unfortunately, Sheikh Raşid is in jail, I think almost 2 years now, is it? Democracy is no closer to being restored. So it doesn't look successful. But it succeeded a lot longer than any Arab democracy ever has.
I have a question.
Yes.
Well, it's a bit controversial.
The more controversial, the better.
Yeah.
Bring it on.
I am Tunisian.
You're Tunisian.
Yeah.
Ahlan.
And I was part of another party during at least 2 or 3 years, from 2012 to 2015.
Yes.
And I can say that when I listen to this,
I'm sorry, say it again?
when I listen to this presentation,
Yep.
it sounds very valuable. But when I remember how Nahda was trying to break down all of this philosophy on its policies, it was pretty utopian, because I believe that the political consensus that Sheikh Raşid Gannuşi made led us and paved the way now to 2021 coup d'etat.
So that's what I was trying to say. A lot of people blame that decision or blame the fall of the revolution on that decision. So you're giving us an example of that view. So please, yeah.
Exactly, because sometimes the Manda Wars has two rules, but it didn't. And it has another times to play the role of opposition, but it didn't. So it was that kind of, who are you? Or not who are you as a Nahda, who are you as a political elite? So people, they made the argument really for quite saying that these political elite are playing together just to rule you. They don't care about you. And taking into consideration that the economic factor was also played a huge role in convincing that, look, 10 years, these people, I mean the political elite, are just playing together to maintain ruling the country, but the economic situation and circumstances are going from bad to worse. So what I want to say, it sounds good, but when it comes to reality, I think it's pretty, I don't know, this is my evaluation, that it is pretty utopian. You cannot break it down.
So the Muslim democracy stuff is not utopian. In fact, that's exactly what you said, right? Like the idea to seek for agreement and consensus. Now, the point being that all of these are political judgments. Ijtihad siyasi. And in any kind of ijtihad, there's no truth. There's only dhann, right? There's judgment, and judgment can be right or wrong, and you don't necessarily know. So your view has a lot of strength behind it. There are lots of people that think that the goal should have been to uproot the old elite, to transform the bureaucracy. Or alternatively, the view could be, if Ennahda doesn't win, they should stay in opposition. Let them govern. You can be in politics, you don't always have to be in the coalition. Now, that's a very, very plausible view. The problem with that view is what? We don't know that timeline. That's a conjecture about that timeline. Now, imagine a different timeline. Okay, let me give you 3 examples. You guys tell me if you're bored. I'm going to give you 3 alternative timelines. One, let's call it Marzoukistan. Today, former President Marzouki says the mistake was not to have a real revolution. Okay, 2011, Ben Ali's gone. There's elections. And Nahdha is the first party. Then Congress for the Republic. Then Tayyar. Okay. So, real revolution. You go in. You take over the institutions. You get rid of the old elites. You get rid of the old bureaucrats. You clean out the deep state. What does that look like? What does that look like? Turkey did it gradually. It looks like Iran, 1979. They're not going to think it's Dr. Marzouki, the human rights activist, that is, storming the Bastille. Here comes Sheikh Rashid back from England. He's there 6 months, and all of a sudden, they're leading an Islamist revolution to clean out everything. That's how that looks. Now, maybe it was the right thing to do. Who wouldn't like a real revolution? To get rid of old corrupt elites. It's very dangerous. If you do that, you better win. Because if you don't, you're going to get couped in 6 months. France is going to blockade you. There's going to be sanctions. Okay? So that timeline, maybe you win. And then in that timeline, what if you still screw it up? What if there's still unemployment? What if there's still inflation? Okay? That's one timeline. Timeline 2, you have the crisis of 2013. Actually, I think there's only 2 timelines. You have the crisis of 2013, and there was the assassinations. There's the coup in Egypt. You have people couldn't wait to see Gannouchi back in jail. I'll tell you a tiny story. I was recently at a conference in Canada, and there was a Tunisian guy at the conference, intellectual, a professor of literature. And he first starts, I like Gannouchi, I had friends, and then he starts drinking. And he says, you know what, I'm glad Gannouchi's in jail. What? Like, this is not some, Bourguibist, who's 80 years old. He's this young liberal guy. In my town, I think it was Sousse or something like this, he came to speak during the election. And he said there was going to be free Wi-Fi. And then, where's my free Wi-Fi? There's no free Wi-Fi. I'm glad he's in jail. This is one anecdote, but the commitment to democracy is this thin. I would meet lots of people. I think Gannouchi should be in jail. Why? Because, did he do the assassinations? No. Why should he be in jail? I don't know. So, you know this mentality better than I do. You're Tunisian. Okay, so the idea that you have a long social commitment to respecting your opponents, that didn't exist. Okay, so 2013, the coup in Egypt, the assassinations. Gannouchi says, Marzouki's going to lose, or we'll try to keep up Marzouki. We'll go for whatever we can. And then we'll do anything possible to stop RCD from coming back into power. That's the revolutionary Tayyar. Then what happens? They're dying to have another coup, to put you back in jail. So maybe on that timeline, you don't get the revolution. You don't get, full employment and social justice and bread. Maybe you get Egypt already then, in 2013-14. So that's timeline 2. Timeline 3, okay, maybe Beji doesn't do that, and Nahdha stays in opposition. Maybe. Maybe that would have been the right thing to do. But you don't, are the people then going to say, and Nahdha's not in government, now they're still the good guys? You don't know. So I hear what you're saying, and I respect it. I'm not saying that you're wrong. How could I? You're Tunisian, I'm not.
No.
But all of these counterfacts, I know Marzouki very well, and I talked to him, and he has all of this resentment about the loss of the revolution, but he has no sense of what actual political possibilities there were. What does it take to actually, so somebody said Turkey, right? What does it take to do what Erdogan did? To actually change the judges, actually change the military, actually change the bureaucracy. Whether you like it or not, and I assume here many people don't, it's a force of political wizardry and will and determination and Machiavellianism that fails more times than it succeeds. So it's very sad, it's very depressing. But my view is that this idea that there's this alternative timeline where Ennahda is more thuwar, more revolutionary, and doesn't make a deal, and that everything works out, maybe dealing with Beji was a mistake. But to say that, you have to take seriously the 10 other possible mistakes on the other side of the ledger. That's the only thing that I would say.
We ran out.
We ran out of time. We just started.
Unfortunately,
Oh,
it's been 1.5
sorry.
hours.
I apologize.
Thank you very much for your insights and for your presentation. Before we end, I would like to invite Ms. Raşid Gannuşi. She has a few words regarding Sheikh Gannushi's latest status. So, welcome again.
Thank you.
Can you come in here a little bit for video?
I don't want to take a lot of your time, I'll be brief. So I just wanted to thank the organizers, thank the Political Science and International Relations Club at Boğaziçi University, and thank you all for coming, and thank Andrew for his very rich and insightful presentation, for organizing this very important event to discuss these very important ideas of democracy in the Muslim world, consensus building, pluralism, citizenship, these ideas that I believe are still as relevant and needed today in the Muslim world as they were when these articles in this book were. When we look today at what's happening, the latest developments in Syria, for instance, as Syria comes out of a brutal dictatorship and hopefully begins to build a new, inclusive, free and democratic society, it's these very same ideas that will be needed there. And as we speak of the victory of the Syrian revolution, this reminds me that today, the 17th of December, is the 14th anniversary of the sparking of Tunisia's revolution that was the spark of all what came to be known as the Arab Spring. And the victory of the Syrian revolution gives us hope that even if revolutions see ups and downs, gains and losses, we should not be quick to write them off or to mourn prematurely these revolutions. They're not over. And the sacrifices of people who continue to believe in the dream of building free, inclusive, pluralistic Muslim societies demonstrate that these revolutions are not over and continue. Back to the book. The co-author, my father, Sheikh Raşid Gannuşi, cannot be here today because he's spending his 600th day in prison today. He's facing 10 separate, ridiculous, politically motivated charges for the crime of continuing to be committed and to promote these same values of democracy and pluralism, and for opposing the return of dictatorship in Tunisia. As we currently in Tunisia sadly do not have much trust in the independence of the judiciary since the coup of July 2021. We, especially us outside, we are focusing on raising awareness of the injustice against my father and many others in Tunisia through the media, through diplomacy, through such events that contribute to raising awareness and keeping alive these ideas and this important legacy. And anything you yourselves can do in this regard will be helpful and greatly appreciated. And I end by saying that the joyful scenes of prisoners breaking free out of the torture cells and the jails of Al-Assad that we have we were all so happy to watch in Syria will be seen in Tunisia and across our region. Thank you.
Thank you very much.